The house smelled like roasted turkey, sweet potatoes, and fresh pie. Laughter echoed from the dining room. Plates clinked, glasses touched in toasts. But Margaret stood alone in the cold hallway, holding a small dish of cranberry sauce that no one had asked for. Her hands trembled. She looked through the open doorway and saw them all gathered around the long oak table. Her daughter, Susan, sat at the head. Her son-in-law laughed too loudly at something Susan said. The grandkids, now teenagers, scrolled through their phones between bites. No one looked toward the hallway. No one noticed her standing there. Margaret had dressed carefully that morning. A soft blue sweater her late husband always liked. A simple, pearl necklace she hadn't worn in years. She had brushed her silver hair until it shined. She wanted to feel part of the family, to feel seen. But as the hours passed, she realized she was invisible. Earlier, when she tried to place her small dish on the table, Susan had stopped her with a polite but firm smile. "Oh, Mom, we have plenty already. You can leave that in the kitchen." The words stung. Margaret nodded and quietly stepped back. She watched as Susan's friends filled the empty seats. People she barely knew, neighbors, co-workers, strangers, who laughed at stories she wasn't part of. She heard someone say, "It's nice to finally have a peaceful Thanksgiving without the drama." There was a quiet chuckle, then more laughter. Margaret's face burned. Was she the drama? Was she the problem? The clatter of forks and knives grew louder. Her heart pounded as she glanced toward the back door. Maybe she should leave. But where? Would she go? This was her home, too, once. She blinked back tears and forced herself to breathe. Susan's voice carried over the noise. "I'm so thankful for everyone here. This year has been about new beginnings." Margaret swallowed hard. She knew what Susan meant. After her husband passed last year, everything changed. Susan had taken over the house, invited her to stay for a while, and slowly pushed her further into the background. Now, on Thanksgiving, she wasn't even offered a seat at the table. Margaret turned and walked toward the guest room, the small, stuffy space at the end of the hall where she now lived. As she reached for the door, she noticed it was locked. Confused, she jiggled the handle. Nothing. She knocked softly. No answer. She heard soft footsteps behind her. Susan appeared, holding a wine glass. Her smile was tight. "Mom, we thought you might like a little quiet time. You've been so tired lately. We don't want you to overdo it." Margaret stared at her daughter. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. She felt a tightness in her chest. Susan gently touched her arm, guiding her away. "Why don't you rest in the den? We'll check on you later." As Susan walked away, Margaret stood frozen in the hallway. The sound of laughter filled the house again, louder this time, like waves crashing over her. Her eyes burned, but she refused to cry. She clenched her fists, feeling the sting of her nails against her palm. In that moment, something inside her shifted. Margaret sat in the quiet den, her hands resting on her lap. The laughter from the dining room was distant now, like a fading song she once knew by heart. Her mind drifted back, far from this cold moment, to the life she had built for them all. She remembered the tiny apartment where it all started. She and her husband, Frank, were young and broke, but full of hope. She worked double shifts at the diner while Frank fixed cars in a greasy shop down the street. They didn't have much, but every dollar they earned went into building a better life for their children. When Susan was born, Margaret stayed up through endless nights, rocking her baby to sleep, whispering soft songs while Frank snored in the sea. Next room, exhausted from work. Even when her own body ached, even when the bills piled high, Margaret never let Susan feel the weight of their struggle. She sewed little dresses from old fabric scraps, made homemade baby food, and clipped coupons late into the night to stretch every dollar. As Susan grew, so did the sacrifices. Margaret gave up her small dreams one by one. She once wanted to go to nursing school, but tuition was too high. Instead, she took extra shifts, cleaned houses on weekends, and sold homemade pies at the church fair to bring in a little more. She told herself it was worth it, as long as Susan and later her son had what they needed. When school plays came around, Margaret was always in the front row, clapping the loudest, cheering with pride. She baked cookies for school fundraisers, stayed up late helping with science projects, and drove carpool in the freezing rain. The other mothers often complimented her, saying, "You do so much, Margaret." She would just smile and say, "That's what mothers do." Holidays were always special in their home. Margaret cooked for days, making sure every dish was perfect. The house smelled of cinnamon, roasted meats, and fresh bread. She polished the good china, lit candles, and played soft music while her family gathered around the table. Frank would carve the turkey, and Susan would giggle while sneaking marshmallows from the sweet potatoes. Those were her favorite days, the ones where laughter filled every corner of their tiny home. Even when Frank got sick, Margaret held everything together. She took care of him, changing his bandages, feeding him, helping him dress. She watched him fade away day by day, but never let the children see her cry. She wanted to protect them from the heaviness of it all. After Frank passed, the house felt colder, emptier, but Margaret stayed strong for Susan and her family. When Susan married and had kids of her own, Margaret was there too. She babysat when Susan went back to work, sometimes overnight. She cooked meals, folded laundry, and rocked her grandbabies to sleep just like she had done years ago. She never asked for payment, never complained. She only wanted to help. She only wanted to feel needed. As Susan's family grew more successful, their world grew bigger. New friends, bigger houses, expensive vacations. But Margaret's world stayed small. She moved in with them when the mortgage got too high, and Susan said, "It'll be easier for you, Mom." Margaret agreed, thinking she would be close to her family. She pictured evenings full of laughter, board games, and home-cooked meals. But slowly, things changed. Her place in the house became smaller, her voice quieter. Invitations to dinners grew fewer. Decisions were made without her. She became the quiet shadow in the background, stepping carefully so she wouldn't be a burden. Margaret didn't resent the sacrifices. She never regretted what she gave. She loved them, truly loved them. That's what made the loneliness sting even more. She had poured her whole life into them. Every dream, every hour, every heartbeat had been for her family. And now, on this Thanksgiving night, they had locked her out of her own room, left her standing in the hallway like a guest in her own life. She blinked, coming back to the present, her hands clenched again, the warmth of old memories mixed with the sharp sting of her reality. She had given everything, and they had forgotten. Margaret sat still in the dim den. The soft hum of voices floated through the walls like whispers meant to haunt her. She tried to focus on the ticking clock instead, but her mind wouldn't stop, spinning. Every word, every glance from earlier replayed in her head. She had thought it couldn't get worse, but it was about to. Susan's voice rang out again from the dining room. "I don't know how much longer we can keep doing this," she said, her tone sharp. The clinking of silverware paused for a moment. Margaret froze, leaning slightly toward the door, barely breathing. Susan's husband, Mark, spoke next, lowering his voice but not enough. "She's been here for years, Susan. We've done more than enough. The kids feel uncomfortable. They don't want to bring their friends over anymore. Honestly, it's just exhausting." Margaret's chest tightened. She gripped the armrest of the chair, her nails digging into the fabric. Susan sighed. I know, but what am I supposed to do? She has nowhere else to go. She's my mother." Her words sounded more like a complaint than concern. "I just feel like I'm always tiptoeing around her. Every time I want to relax in my own house, she's there, always watching, always needing something. It's like having another child. Mark let out a short laugh. She is a child. Can't even manage her pills without help. She forgets everything. If we're not careful, we'll end up changing her diapers in a few years. A low chuckle passed around the table. One of the guests whispered something that Margaret couldn't quite catch, but it made the others laugh louder. Margaret's vision blurred. Her ears rang. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Susan's voice softened, but it cut even deeper. I never thought taking her in would turn into this. I just wanted to help after Dad died, but sometimes I wish I'd hired a nurse instead. Someone who knows how to handle this kind of thing. This kind of thing. That's how her daughter described her now, like a broken appliance taking up space. Margaret swallowed hard, her throat dry. She stared down at her hands, trembling in her lap. The same hands that once held Susan as a newborn. The hands that worked, scrubbed, stitched, and cooked to give Susan everything. Now they were nothing but a problem, something to be managed. There was a brief silence, and then one of Susan's friends spoke up. "You've done enough, Susan. At some point, you have to think about yourself and your own family. You've already sacrificed so much." Sacrificed? Margaret nearly gasped. Susan had sacrificed, Mark agreed quickly. Exactly. You have your kids to think about, their future. They don't need this stress hanging over them. She's lived her life. It's your turn now. Susan whispered. Sometimes I feel trapped. Her voice shook, but she wasn't crying. Not like Margaret was. Silent tears ran down Margaret's cheeks, warm against her cold skin. She wiped them quickly, afraid even now to let anyone see her pain. Susan continued. She doesn't understand how hard this is for me. She always plays the victim, and I just can't keep doing it forever. Margaret closed her eyes. The words hit her like stones. Victim, burden, exhausting, trapped. That's how her own daughter saw her. Not as a mother who gave everything, not as the woman who sacrificed her youth, her dreams, her comfort, but as a weight, a problem, an inconvenience. The laughter in the room swelled again, light and casual. They were already moving on to lighter topics: Thanksgiving plans, Black Friday sales, vacation ideas for Christmas, as if they hadn't just shattered her heart into 1,000 pieces. Margaret sat frozen, numb. She didn't storm out. She didn't scream or argue. She simply sat there, staring at nothing. The warmth from the fireplace couldn't reach her. The cozy blankets folded neatly nearby offered no comfort. Her chest rose and fell with shallow breaths. The ticking clock sounded louder now, like a countdown. She felt something inside her shifting again, deeper this time. The hurt was too sharp to cry over. It dug into a place she didn't know existed, and in that place, a quiet voice began to speak. Not loud, not angry, just steady. It said, "Enough." But she wasn't ready to act, not yet. She just sat there, holding the pain close, like a fragile glass that might shatter if she moved too quickly. The days grew longer after Thanksgiving. The house that once buzzed with laughter now hummed with silence. Margaret sat by the window most mornings, watching the wind move the bare tree branches. Winter crept in, but the cold outside didn't match the emptiness she felt inside. Susan was always busy. The grandkids came and went, rushing past her like shadows. Margaret would smile and greet them softly, but they barely looked up from their phones. She tried to start conversations, but they ended quickly with mumbled words and hurried steps. "Busy with school, Grandma." "Sorry, I have to go, Grandma." "Can we talk later, Grandma?" Later never came. Margaret's phone sat on the small table beside her chair. She stared at it often, hoping it would ring. Sometimes she would pick it up and check, just to make sure it was working. The screen always showed the same thing. No missed calls, no new messages. Days passed without a single word from anyone. She tried calling old friends. The first few times, she left cheerful messages. "Hi, it's Margaret." Just calling to catch up. But most didn't call back. Some numbers had changed. A few had been disconnected. She tried not to take it personally, but each unanswered call felt like another door closing. Her birthday came and went with barely a whisper. She had circled the date on her small calendar, hoping someone would remember. That morning she got up early, dressed nicely, and waited. Hours passed. No one came. No one called. Late in the evening, Susan walked by and glanced at her. "Oh, was today your birthday?" she said lightly. "I completely lost track. I've been swamped at work." Margaret forced a smile. "That's all right, dear." Susan patted her shoulder and kept walking, already on the phone with someone else. Margaret sat back down in her chair, folding her hands neatly in her lap, feeling the sting of forgotten love. Even small moments became reminders of her loneliness. She used to bake cookies with her grandchildren every Saturday. Now, the kitchen stayed clean and quiet. The grandkids went to movies, parties, and school events without inviting her. She saw the photos later on Susan's social media, a world she no longer belonged to. She tried once to suggest a family dinner. "Maybe we could all have a nice meal together one evening," she asked gently. Susan sighed. "Mom, the kids have so much going on. Mark's work schedule is crazy. Let's see, okay? Maybe next month." Next month never came. Margaret stopped asking. The house itself seemed to push her further into the shadows. The guest room door stayed closed most of the time. She was given a small corner of the den, where her chair, a lamp, and a small table became her entire world. The TV played quietly, more for background noise than real company. Meals were left on a tray. Susan would set it down and say, "Here you go, Mom. I'll check on you later." Then she would disappear again. Later was always too late. Sometimes Margaret would sit outside on the small patio, wrapping herself in a thick blanket. She watched the neighbors come and go, waving at them when they looked her way. Some waved back politely. Others didn't notice her at all. The days blurred together. Morning coffee, afternoon tea, quiet dinners alone. The clock ticked on, marking hours filled with silence. She read books to pass the time, but the words couldn't fill the ache in her chest. The house was full of people, yet she had never felt so alone. At night she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. She listened to the faint sounds of laughter from upstairs, muffled by closed doors. She imagined what they were talking about. Plans, dreams, inside jokes she no longer understood. She was still here, living under the same roof. But in every way that mattered, they had already moved on without her. The emptiness wasn't just in the house, it was inside her. A hollow space where love used to live. She had become invisible, forgotten. A quiet ghost sitting in plain sight. And as the silence wrapped around her like a heavy blanket, she began to wonder if they even saw her at all anymore. One cold morning, as the soft light crept through the thin curtains, Margaret woke earlier than usual. The house was still. The usual noises of Susan bustling around or the grandkids stomping down the stairs hadn't started yet. For once, the quiet didn't feel as heavy. It felt peaceful. She sat up slowly, wrapping her shawl around her shoulders, and looked around. Her little corner of the den. The same books, the same lamp, the same small table. But something nudged at her today, something different. She couldn't explain it, but it felt like a small stirring inside her chest, a breath she hadn't taken in a long time. She walked carefully to the hallway, her hand steadying her on the wall. Her steps took her toward the small closet Susan rarely opened anymore. The door creaked as she pulled it. Inside, stacked neatly, were some of the boxes Susan had packed when she moved Margaret into the house. Margaret had not opened them since. She sat on the floor and pulled the first box. Closer. Dust tickled her nose, but she smiled gently and kept going. Inside were photo albums, old cards, yellowed papers, and folded documents. She ran her fingers across the worn leather of an album and opened it slowly. Pictures of Susan as a child. Smiled back at her. Birthday parties, school plays, family trips where they couldn't afford fancy hotels, but always made it work. There was Frank, holding Susan on his shoulders at the beach. There was Margaret herself, standing proudly next to her first homemade Thanksgiving turkey. The memories warmed her chest. These were the moments she had lived for, the reason she had worked so hard. But beneath the warmth was something stronger. Now, proof. Proof that she was never the burden they now saw her as. She had built this life for them. She had been their foundation. As she flipped through the pages, a folded piece of paper slipped out and landed on her lap. She opened it carefully. It was an old letter from Frank, written just a year before he passed. The ink had faded slightly, but his handwriting was still clear. My dearest Maggie, you've carried this family on your back through storms and sunshine. You gave up so much for us, and I see it even when others forget. If anything happens to me, promise me one thing. Never let anyone make you feel small. You are the strongest woman I've ever known. Our children have what they have because of you. You are the heart of this family. I love you forever. Frank. Margaret's eyes welled up, but for the first time in months, her tears didn't come from sadness. They came from something warmer. She read the letter again, letting every word sink into her. Frank had seen her. He had known. Her fingers traced the paper gently as if touching his hand one last time. She whispered softly, "Thank you, Frank." She kept digging through the box. Beneath a stack of old bills was a folder she had almost forgotten about. Inside were the property papers for the house. Her name was still there, printed clearly next to Frank's. When Susan had convinced her to move in, she had never officially transferred the ownership. The house still legally belonged to her. Margaret sat back, staring at the paper. She hadn't even thought about it before. Susan and Mark treated her like a guest, like someone they were doing a favor for. But this house, this was her home. She had paid for it, sacrificed for it, built it with Frank piece by piece. Her heart beat steady, not fast, not anxious, steady. Margaret stood up carefully, holding the folder and the letter close to her chest. She walked back to her chair and sat down, breathing deeply. The house was still quiet, but it no longer felt empty. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel powerless. She didn't know exactly what she would do yet, but she knew one thing for certain. She was not a burden. She was not invisible. She was not weak. The small spark inside her had turned into a soft glow. She felt Frank's words like a steady hand on her back, giving her strength. Margaret looked out the window, watching the morning sun rise higher. The world outside moved on like always, but inside her, something had shifted. They had forgotten who she was. But she hadn't, not anymore. The next morning, Margaret moved quietly, just as she always had. But inside, everything felt different. Her steps were steady. Her mind was clear. She didn't need to argue. She didn't need to cry. She simply needed to act. Susan was busy rushing the kids out the door for school. Mark had already left for work. No one paid attention as Margaret slowly pulled on her coat and wrapped her scarf around her neck. She held her small purse close and stepped outside. The air was cold and sharp, but it felt good against her skin. She walked down the street and waited for the bus like she used to long ago. She hadn't taken a bus in years, but today she was ready. At the lawyer's office, the receptionist greeted her kindly. "Good morning, ma'am. Do you have an appointment?" Margaret smiled softly. "Yes, with Mr. Parker. He handled my husband's estate." A few minutes later, she sat across from Mr. Parker, a man who had grown older since she last saw him but still had kind eyes. He smiled when he saw her. "Mrs. Wilson, it's been a long time. How can I help you?" Margaret placed the folder on his desk and opened it. "I need to update a few things." He looked through the papers carefully, nodding. "I see. The house is still in your name. Most people assume it was transferred, but legally nothing changed." "That's correct," she said calmly. "And you'd like to?" he asked gently. Margaret folded her hands on her lap. "I want to make sure everything is in proper order. My will, my savings, my property. I want full control over everything I own. I also want to appoint a new executor." Mr. Parker looked up, surprised but respectful. "You want to remove your daughter?" "Yes." Her voice was firm but calm. "She's made it clear that my care is a burden. I'd like someone else to handle my affairs if anything happens to me." He nodded. "Do you have someone in mind?" "My niece Claire. She's always been kind. She checks on me often." "Excellent choice," Mr. Parker said, jotting notes. "We'll update everything and make sure it's all protected. No one can touch your assets without your approval, Margaret." Exhaled slowly, feeling lighter already. "Thank you." As they worked through the details, Mr. Parker explained everything clearly, double-checking each form. Margaret listened carefully, signing each page with steady hands. When they finished, he handed her a copy of the documents. "It's all done, Mrs. Wilson. If anyone tries to make decisions without your consent, they'll find it's not so." "Simple." Margaret smiled, the first real smile in weeks. "That's exactly what I wanted." On her way home, she made one more stop, her bank. She updated her accounts, added protections, and secured her savings. Everything was now separate. From Susan's reach, quietly, without fuss, she had taken back control of her own life. When she returned home, the house was still busy with its usual noise. Susan barely noticed as Margaret slipped back into her chair in the den. The children ran up and down the stairs. The TV played loudly in the background. Susan walked by with her coffee. "Did you go for a walk, Mom? That's nice. Fresh air is good for you." Margaret simply nodded. "Yes, dear, it was a good walk." Susan smiled, not thinking twice. She had no idea what Margaret had done that day. No one did, and that's how Margaret wanted it. For now, she sat quietly in her chair, listening to the familiar sounds of the house. But inside, everything was different. She no longer felt trapped. She no longer felt small. She was calm. She was steady. They still thought she was weak. They still thought she would sit quietly forever, but they were wrong. She didn't need to raise her voice to win. She didn't need to fight to be seen. She simply needed to be smart, patient, and ready. And now she was. The day came faster than they expected. It started like any other morning. The kids were rushing to get ready for school. Mark was reading emails at the kitchen table. Susan was juggling her phone and coffee, giving quick orders to everyone. Margaret sat in her chair, quiet as always. But inside, she was ready. The doorbell rang. Everyone paused. Susan frowned and walked to the front door. Standing there was a man in a dark suit holding a briefcase. "Good morning. I'm Mr. Daniels, representing Mrs. Wilson." Susan blinked. "My mother? Is something wrong?" Mr. Daniels smiled politely. "I'm here to inform you that, effective immediately, control of this property has returned fully to Mrs. Wilson. Legal ownership has been confirmed. This home, and all assets connected to it, belong solely to her." Mark stood up from the table, his face hardening. "What are you talking about? We live here. This is our house." Mr. Daniels kept his tone calm. "Actually, it never was. Your wife's mother retained ownership. The paperwork is all in order. You've been guests here, at her kindness. That arrangement has now changed." Susan's face turned pale. "Mom? What is this?" Margaret stood slowly, her hands steady. She looked at her daughter with clear, calm eyes. I've made some decisions, Susan. Quietly, carefully. Susan stepped closer, her voice shaking. But we've lived here for years. You can't just— I can, Margaret said, her voice firm but not loud. And I have. Mark's voice grew sharp. We've paid the bills. We've taken care of you. Margaret looked at him, her face unreadable. You took care of yourselves. I was never a burden, Mark, but you made me one. Susan's eyes filled with tears. We're family. Margaret nodded softly. Yes, and family should never treat each other like you treated me. Mr. Daniels handed Susan an envelope. You have 30 days to make new living arrangements. Mrs. Wilson has graciously allowed this time out of respect. After that, all access to the property will be restricted. The house fell into stunned silence. The kids stared wide-eyed from the stairs. Mark opened his mouth to argue again, but Margaret raised one hand gently, stopping him without a word. There's nothing more to discuss, she said. Her voice was calm, but it carried the full weight of her strength. The lawyer turned to leave. Susan stood frozen, holding the envelope, her hands shaking. Margaret walked back to her chair, her steps slow, steady, and strong. She sat down, folded her hands in her lap, and looked out the window. For the first time in years, the view felt different. The sky seemed brighter. The weight in her chest was gone. The house was hers again. Her peace was hers again. The years of sacrifice, the pain, the loneliness. They could never take that from her, but they would no longer take anything else either. She didn't need to scream. She didn't need to cry. She had taken back everything, and now the silence finally felt beautiful. The calls started the very next day. The house was still full of boxes as Susan and Mark packed in a hurry, their voices sharp and panicked. But Margaret sat quietly in her chair, sipping her tea, watching the morning sun spread across the room. Her phone buzzed softly on the table beside her. She glanced at it. Susan's name flashed on the screen. She let it ring. The call ended. A few seconds later, it buzzed again, then again. Margaret reached out, not to answer, but to turn the phone face down. The silence returned. Later, voicemails began to pile up. Susan's voice sounded desperate at first. Mom, please, can we talk? This has all been a misunderstanding. Another message followed. We were stressed, that's all. Things got out of hand. We didn't mean it. Hours later, Mark's voice filled the next voicemail. You're being unreasonable. We've done so much for you. Think about the kids. They need stability. Margaret heard every word, but felt nothing. The voices floated past her like soft wind through trees. They had spoken loud enough for years. Now it was her turn to be silent. By evening, Susan's voice shifted to tears. Mom, please. I didn't mean to say those things. I was overwhelmed. You know I love you. Please answer. Margaret sat on the patio, wrapped in her shawl, watching. The stars appear one by one. The cool night air brushed against her face. The phone kept buzzing beside her, but she no longer looked at it. In the following days, they tried everything. Texts, emails, even letters left at the door. We miss you. Let's start over. Think of the children. You're still our mother. Margaret read the letters once, then placed them neatly in a drawer. She didn't need to respond. Their words no longer held power. Neighbors whispered as Susan and Mark moved out. Some offered polite smiles, unsure of what had happened. Margaret greeted them kindly, her voice gentle, her smile steady. She owed no one an explanation. The house was quiet again. But now, the silence was hers. She filled her days with soft music, good books, and long walks. She baked pies just for herself, filling the house with sweet smells that brought back only the good memories. She planted flowers in the front yard, watching them bloom under her. Careful touch. Sometimes her niece Claire would visit. They would sit together on the porch, drinking tea, talking softly. Claire never asked about Susan. She simply kept Margaret company, bringing warmth without expectations. One afternoon, as they sat in the garden, Claire glanced at the buzzing phone. Susan was calling again. "Do you want me to get that, Aunt?" "Margaret?" Claire asked gently. Margaret shook her head, her eyes calm. "No, dear, let it ring." Claire smiled softly. "You're strong, you know." Margaret returned the smile. "I've always been strong. I just forgot for a while." The phone eventually stopped ringing as the days turned into weeks. The messages grew fewer. The apologies became shorter. And finally, the silence stretched long and wide. Margaret felt no anger, no bitterness. She simply felt peace. She had carried them for so many years. She had given everything. But now, she carried only herself. And that was enough. The house, once filled with voices that drowned her out, now echoed softly with her own breath, her own footsteps, her own quiet strength. And as the wind moved gently through the trees outside, Margaret leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes, breathing deeply. She was free. The morning sun poured through the window, casting a soft golden glow across the wooden floor. Margaret sat at her small kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea. She watched the steam rise, curling gently in the still air. She thought about everything: the long years, the sacrifices, the heartache, and the silence that once felt so heavy. And yet, sitting here now, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: peace. They had called her a burden. They had made her feel small, like her presence was something to be tolerated. For so long, she believed them. She carried their words like heavy stones in her chest, thinking maybe she had become too much, too old, too needy. But they were wrong. She remembered the beginning, the tiny apartment where she and Frank first made a home out of nothing. The long nights working extra shifts, the simple dinners filled with laughter, the homemade birthday cakes with crooked candles. Every small thing she did with love. Not because she had to, but because she wanted to. She remembered rocking Susan to sleep, wiping away tears after scraped knees, staying up late to help with homework, clapping the loudest at every school play. She had filled their lives with comfort, safety, and warmth. She remembered caring for Frank through his sickness, holding his hand when he was too weak to speak, whispering words of comfort as he slipped away. She had carried that pain quietly, never showing her children the full weight of her grief. She wanted to protect them from sorrow, even as it consumed her. And later, when Susan needed help with her own children, Margaret was there. She cooked, cleaned, babysat, and offered a steady hand whenever they needed one. She never asked for anything in return. She had given her life to them, not because she was weak, but because she was strong, because that's what love looks like. They had forgotten all of it. They saw only the parts that were inconvenient. They saw only what they wanted to see. But Margaret remembered. She was never the burden. She was the foundation. Her strength was not loud. It never needed to be. It was steady, like the roots of an old tree, deep, unseen, but holding everything above steady through every storm. She had weathered their rejection. She had walked through the loneliness. And when they tried to strip her of everything, she stood tall in silence and took back what was hers. Now, as the soft breeze moved the curtains gently, she smiled to herself. Her house was quiet, but it was full of peace. The flowers she planted bloomed brightly outside. The warm smell of fresh bread filled the air. The birds sang softly in the trees. She no longer waited for calls that didn't come. She no longer checked messages that once filled her with hope or disappointment. She had released the need for their approval. Her worth had never lived in their words. It lived in every sacrifice, every act of love, Every moment she had held her family together, and now she held herself together with the same quiet strength. Claire arrived later that afternoon, carrying a basket of fresh fruit. "Good morning, Aunt Margaret." Margaret smiled warmly. "Good morning, dear." They sat together on the porch, sipping tea and listening to the soft chirps of the birds. After a while, Claire looked at her and said softly, "You look happy." Margaret nodded, her eyes bright. "I am." "You're not lonely?" Claire asked gently. Margaret shook her head. "No, I was lonely when I lost myself, but not anymore. I remember who I am now." Claire smiled and reached for her hand. "You've always been strong." Margaret squeezed her hand gently. "I just forgot for a little while, but I remember now. I was never the burden. I was the one who carried everyone else." The sun dipped lower, casting soft orange light across the yard. The flowers swayed in the breeze, their bright colors glowing in the fading light. Margaret breathed deeply, feeling the peace settle in her chest. She had given her family everything, and though they forgot, she would always know the truth. She was never weak. She was never a problem to be solved. She was, and always had been, strong. The evening sun slipped gently behind the trees, casting a soft amber glow across the house. The dining room table stood polished and ready, set carefully with one plate, one glass, and a simple linen napkin, folded just so. Margaret moved slowly around the room, lighting a few candles, their small flames dancing warmly in the growing dusk. The house was quiet, not empty, quiet, a peaceful kind of quiet. She carried the roasted chicken from the oven, the smell filling the room with rich, familiar comfort. Steamed vegetables sat in a small bowl beside a basket of fresh, warm rolls. There was no large turkey, no sweet potatoes stacked high, no crowd of voices, only her, and that was enough. She poured herself a small glass of wine, the deep red liquid, swirling softly in the glass. She placed it down, pulled out her chair, and sat. For years, she had stood on the outside of this table, holding dishes no one asked for, waiting for permission to belong. For years, she had listened to laughter that didn't include her, conversations that moved on without her. She had been told, with words and without, that she was a guest in the life she helped build. But not tonight. Tonight, she chose her seat. She chose her meal. She chose her peace. Margaret sliced into the chicken, each motion calm and sure. She savored every bite slowly, tasting not just the food, but the freedom that now lived inside her. Her eyes traveled across the table, landing softly on the framed photo of Frank she had placed at the center. His warm smile looked back at her. She lifted her glass gently. "To us," she whispered, "and to everything we built." The candlelight flickered, casting a soft glow across the photo. For a moment she felt as though he was right there beside her, proud and steady as always. The clock ticked softly in the background. Outside, the wind rustled the trees, but inside, everything was still. There was no anger in her heart, no sadness pressing down on her chest. Only calm, only strength. Her phone sat on the counter, silent. She hadn't checked it all day. She didn't need to. Whatever apologies or excuses waited, there didn't matter anymore. They had offered their words too late. She had found something stronger than their regret. She had found herself. As she finished her meal, she leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes for a moment, breathing in deeply. The air smelled of warm bread, roasted herbs, and quiet victory. For so long, she thought she needed their seat at the table. She thought she needed their approval, their invitations, their love given conditionally. But she didn't. She had never needed to fight for a place she had built with her own two hands. She didn't need to beg to be seen. She didn't need to be rescued. She had rescued herself. Margaret stood up, carried her plate to the kitchen, and cleaned up slowly, calmly. The house hummed softly with the sounds of home, her home. She turned off the lights, leaving only the soft candlelight glowing in the dining room. She stood for a moment, looking at the table one last time before heading to bed. This time, she had eaten at her table, alone and free.